Hello, and welcome to Info Overload, your place for fast and easy learning. For today's video, we shall discuss the COVID-19 problem affecting the entire world right now. And as of July 24, more than 15 million cases had been recorded worldwide. And even control measures had been applied. Still, the numbers are ramping up, and all indicators show that this disease will be with us for quite some time. Now, since COVID-19 is a very lengthy topic to discuss, we shall divide it into three separate videos. And today, for part one, we shall have four subtopics for today, and it will cover first the nature of viruses and how it infects humans. Second, the communicability of a viral disease. Third, human responses to viral infections. And lastly, the mechanism of a COVID-19 infection. COVID-19 is a viral disease, and the first step in understanding this disease is to know what a virus is and how it works. Viruses has been part of scientific debates for several decades now. This can be attributed to the nature of how a virus exists. Being a submicroscopic entity, it has the distinction of being a gap between the living and the non-living organism. If we are to check the qualities of a living organism and compare it to a virus, it will have all the qualities of a living organism except the ability to reproduce independently. Viruses need to attack and use cellular machinery of its host. Therefore, it needs a host cell. In some sense, a virus will tend to pirate cellular resources in order for it to reproduce. However, a virus cannot infect any cell at will. It will need to attach to specific receptors before it can initiate its reproductive cycle. These receptors are highly important in promulgating viral survival. When a virus attaches to a specific receptor of a host cell, it will gain entry into the cytoplasm and gain access to the Golgi apparatus, ribosomes, and other organelles that is needed to produce viral components. The production of these components, called virions, will continue until a critical mass is achieved within the cell. Once ripe in virions, the cell eventually ruptures and dies, liberating new viruses which can infect other cells. When numerous cells are affected by this process, tissue and organ functionality integrity may be affected, producing a viral disease. There are numerous theories of viral origin, and most experts agree that there is no single correct theory. The coevolution theory is one of the most famous and one of the most widely used theories that explains viral origin. The proponents of this theory believes that cells and viruses existed at the same time, and both of them evolved together, and especially the virus which evolved within their hosts. The progressive viral theory believes that viruses originated from substances that travel in between cells, while in contrast, the regressive theory of viral origin states that viruses came from the remnants of cellular organisms. The cellular theory of viral origin, on the other hand, posits that viruses came from degenerative cells that has lost its ability to reproduce. And lastly, the virus hypothesis, or simply known as the virus first hypothesis. This theory states that viruses evolved from the first molecule of complex protein and nucleic acid. Although the theories mentioned do not agree on exact points of the origin of viruses, they all agree about its nature of not being able to reproduce on their own. And based from the previous slide, when viruses reproduce, it comes at a price: the destruction of a host cell, which can potentially lead to a disease. Viral diseases, although common, can only be possible due to poor host resistance and the adequacy of viral receptors. These receptors are made up of proteins that are species-specific. Therefore, if the host will have no receptor for the virus, there will be no infection. The specificity of the viral receptors is attributed to the exclusivity of viruses to a specific species. For a virus to infect, it must be harbored by its source, or its reservoir. Furthermore, we also have to consider two important qualities of a virus to produce a disease, These are pathogenicity and virulence. These are terms often used interchangeably, but for this discussion, we shall refer to them as not merely as the ability to cause disease, but distinguish them qualitatively. Pathogenicity is the quality that refers to an ability to become pathogenic, while virulence is the deadliness of a pathogenic organism. Put it this way, pathogenicity is a term that refers to what makes you sick, and virulence deals with what makes you ill or severe. Even though a virus that is both pathogenic and virulent is present within a specific environment, it cannot infect nor gain entry into a host, if not for a mode of transmission. Nonetheless, a mode of transmission refers to a process on how an agent is conveyed from a point of origin towards a new host, or in simpler terms, it bridges the gap between the source or its reservoir and another host, thus making communicability possible. A mode of transmission can either be direct or indirect. A direct mechanism involves contact between source or surfaces to an opening or a suitable surface in the body. Examples of these are kissing, sexual intercourse, droplet transmission, and the indirect mechanism, on the other hand, involves a media, like for example air, that either suspends the agent to travel a certain distance or is carried by another entity, like in the case of vehicles and vectors. Once a virus gains entry into a host, it will not instantly lead to an infection, not unless the host is susceptible. Being susceptible makes your body more vulnerable to any infection, and in this case, a viral type. Our host resistance is said to be our best defense for any type of infection, most especially, of course, the viral kind. Our body's quality of resistance can be affected by numerous factors like, for example, we have biological factors. These affects our body from within, such as immature or advanced age, gender, malnutrition, obesity, and stress. Environmental factors are the conditions outside of our body. Examples of these are temperature, climate, humidity, and community congestion. Iatrogenic factors are those induced by medical management, and such of these are medications used for a patient like steroids and immune modulators. Chronic hospitalization and institutional confinement may also be considered here. Pathological factors are the ones produced by disease that our body is currently experiencing or is currently developing. A common example of these are diabetes mellitus, hypertension, cardiac problems, and so on and so forth. No single factor can exclusively make you susceptible. It is always an interplay of multiple factors, including conditions of exposure and the viability of transmissions that are proximal to a person. Once a susceptible host is infected, that same host can also be a source of the virus. If you had noticed, a chain of communicability has been established by the interrelationship of the viral source, mode of transmission, and the susceptible host. Undeniably, this plays a very huge role in today's pandemic. The continuous cycle of infection can accelerate the spread of any communicable disease in a community, but a break in the cycle of infection can significantly stop its spread. Putting it all together, for a viral infection to occur, the host must have a degree of exposure to the viral source in the most favorable environment facilitated by an effective mode of transmission. This in turn will always elicit a response from the body. If there's a break or a nonconformity of any of these components favorable to infection, the chain will be broken and infection will not be possible. Let us assume that everything went favorable for infection. We have a potent virus, a favorable environment, and a viable mode of transmission, and of course a susceptible host. This will trigger an immune response in our body, and take note that our immune system will need to recognize, process, and control the infective agent. This response is very taxing because it will need a lot of resources from our body. Therefore, host factors as we had discussed a while ago, will play a vital role in sustaining the quality of the response. Once an infective agent like a virus who gains entry or access to our body, our immune system will try to get rid of it by utilizing layers of immune response. Innate immunity, being a non-specific response, can be activated from the time of infection up to 96 hours. It's made up of barriers like our skin, mucous membranes, hair-like structures in our respiratory system, and special cells like natural killer cells, macrophages, neutrophils, dendritic cells, mast cells, basophils, eosinophils, just to name a few. If our innate immunity wasn't able to control the infective agent, our adaptive immunity takes over. If there are optimal host factors, the response is said to be adequate because it was able to recognize the threat and control was established. Thus, it leads to disease prevention, and if the viral agent is highly virulent, the host may feel sick, but only to a milder extent. In most cases, it's so mild that the discomforts are not reported. The danger of this is that an infected person can spread the virus without him knowing. On the other hand, if a highly virulent virus was encountered by the host for the first time, it can overwhelm our immune system. Coupled with some factors that weaken the host, the immune response will have difficulty in controlling the invading agent. This eventually leads to an active disease process, or in other words, you get sick. Let us now delve into the coronavirus. By nature, it's a large family of viruses that usually infects lower animals. The alpha and the beta variants are found in bats and rodents. The gamma and the delta are often found in birds. Structurally, they are single-stranded positive-sense RNA viruses with lipid protein membrane envelopes and glycoprotein spikes. Of these structures, the lipid protein membrane is the virus's Achilles heel because it's susceptible and vulnerable to lipid solvents like alcohol, soap, detergents, and disinfectants. In addition, coronaviruses causes mild self-limiting infections among humans. But wait, we had mentioned a while ago that viruses are species-specific. The coronavirus is not a natural human virus, so how come it can infect humans and cause COVID-19? Well, this is due to a process known as zoonosis. Zoonosis is a process in which a virus crosses species via a series of mutations. This can happen when a primary host interacts with an intermediate host, and by the course of nature, due to the exposure of the intermediate host, viruses from the primary host can mutate and infect it. When man comes into play, the virus from the intermediate host can mutate and infect man. COVID-19 is caused by the SARS CoV-2 virus, which is the latest incarnation from the coronavirus family. There has been some speculation that SARS CoV-2 was created and deliberately mutated from a lab. However, a lot of studies reveal that SARS CoV-2 is 92 to 96% similar to the original genome of the coronavirus from bats. Yet, more information may reveal something else soon enough. This is not the first time the coronavirus has jumped species. In 2002 and 2012, we had two important conditions here. We had SARS, and of course, we also have MERS. And of course, last year, the coronavirus made another jump and is the culprit for today's pandemic. By this time, we can now solve the COVID-19 puzzle. For any person to develop COVID-19, that person must first be exposed to sources of SARS CoV-2 infections. In this case, it could be another infected individual. For the infection to push through, it must be effectively transferred from one source to a new host, so we need a mode of transmission. There are two identified MOTs for COVID-19. The first one, and the most prevalent, is via droplet. This process can happen when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. Here, the virus is carried by aerosolized substances from our respiratory tree and is carried for a short distance before it drops into the ground. That is why areas with population congestion and continuous people contact are at the mercy of this mode of transmission. If the droplets land on certain surfaces, it may remain viable and infective for a certain amount of time. The material of the surface will highly determine the viability of the virus, and studies have shown that certain surfaces may support the infective longevity of respiratory droplets. In addition, if a droplet or substance with the virus touches our hands, and our hands in turn comes into contact with mucous membranes of our eyes, nose, or lips, infection is also highly possible. We also have the fecal-oral route. This mechanism occurs when infected people sheds out the virus via the substances of the gastrointestinal tract, particularly from fecal matter. Poor toilet hygiene, improper plumbing, ingesting contaminated or improperly cooked food are just some of the ways on how the virus can be transferred in this manner. That is why it's highly recommended that proper toilet hygiene, hand washing, and proper food preparation must be strictly observed to prevent this mode of transmission. Apparently, there are some studies positing that COVID-19 can also be transmitted via airborne routes. However, majority of the studies that point this out states that it's only possible in controlled environments, like within a hospital, like an ICU, and it can also happen within a household with an air conditioning unit without a proper filtration system. Since this manner of transmission is still under investigation and highly debatable, we shall make another video once a finality has been achieved. Once the virus gains entry into the body, it will attach to its receptor, in this case the ACE2 receptor. These receptors play an important role in the maintenance of the homeostasis of our body, and they are mainly located in the respiratory tree, the digestive system, the cardiovascular system, and the nervous system. As we have discussed earlier, when a virus attaches to its receptor, it will gain access into its host cell and use the cellular machinery to produce its viral components. As the virus produces its DNA or RNA, it reaches a certain critical mass within the cell, and as it's being reached, the cell starts to become abnormal. Functions gets affected and produce different dysfunctions that can be manifestive of a certain disease, in this case COVID-19. The host cell in turn will elaborate surface proteins called major histocompatibility complexes or MHCs. On the other hand, the resulting cellular aberration for viral replication will trigger an inflammatory cascade that will become a double-edged sword. The reactions of organs to inflammation in COVID-19 will be discussed in the next video. These MHCs will send signals to our immune system to signal that something is going wrong and tell our body that something is being infected. Once recognized by the immune system, the response will be highly dependent on the hosts, and as we mentioned earlier, host factors will always play a vital role in the quality of the responses. If there is an adequate or an optimal host condition, the viral attack can be controlled. This in turn leads to a very mild to moderate condition of COVID-19. Mild to moderate conditions of COVID-19 comprise majority of cases. These infections tend to resolve on its own or with some supportive care. Some manifestations may be so mild that it goes unnoticed or may be non-respiratory in nature, thus gaining a condition of being an asymptomatic carrier. However, some researchers claim that the reason for being asymptomatic is either due to the mildness of the condition or the preoccupation with the absence of respiratory discomforts. Most people tend to categorize COVID-19 as a purely respiratory infection. However, roughly 40% of presenting manifestations are non-respiratory. The danger of having a vast majority of mild to moderate infections is that they are often not noticed or taken for granted. Thus, these carriers can be sources of exposure in a certain population. and lead to the massive community transmission of COVID-19. The only consolation of having mild to moderate infections is that it resolves usually on its own even without medical intervention, and in some cases with the help of some medical supportive care. In other schools of thought, since most of the manifestations are so mild and unnoticed, our body doesn't feel that something is going on. That's why some institutions label asymptomatic carriers as pre-symptomatic people. Out of the argument that the virus, when attached to a receptor, will always elicit a response. It's only a matter of how strong the response will be to surpass the body's physiologic threshold in order for the person to subjectively feel a certain discomfort. In the flip side, when host factors are suitable for the disease, this leads to a more rampant and aggressive response, which leads to a severe and critical condition. This in turn opens the body to numerous conditions and complications and even other infections. If the body has less resources to sustain the response, it can lead to fatality. That explains why most casualties of the pandemic are the elderly and people with ongoing clinical comorbidities or chronic diseases. To recap everything we've discussed so far, we had learned that SARS-CoV-2 is the main agent causing COVID-19. Once infecting bats, now has made a big leap to infect humans. Viral infections require various multifactorial conditions to elicit a disease, and that no single factor is dominant in determining our susceptibility to disease. It's always an interplay of variables plus exposure. The response of the body will determine the nature of the viral disease process. If our body's constitution is good and adequate, we can expect to be mild to moderate and in most cases asymptomatic, or in some areas you can be considered pre-symptomatic. However, being such can also be a source of infection for others. COVID-19, although highly infective, can be easily prevented by breaking the chain of infection and altering the factors that can make infection suitable. If we all equip ourselves with the knowledge and understanding of this disease, we can form a cumulative act of being proactive against infections and by a stroke of genius, curve down the number of infections. See you next week for the clinical picture of COVID-19. Consider subscribing to the channel and hit the thumbs up and notification bell to be updated of future videos. Leave a comment down below if you want a medical topic to be discussed so we can info overload you. Thank you very much and keep safe. I'll see you in the next video.